What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the shop and welcome to this episode of Home Built Workshop. Today we're gonna make this cool kind of rustic jewelry holder for my daughter. It's got wire inlay, epoxy fills, and a ton of cup hooks. Check it out. I'm going to kick this project off with a couple of pieces of aged weathered barnwood. It's got that awesome barnwood look on there. This is reclaimed from my grandpa's barn. First thing I need to do is joint a couple edges so I can get ready to glue up a wider panel. I don't have any really wide pieces, so I'm going to glue a couple smaller ones together.
I feel like I don't practice enough with hand tools, so instead of running this on the jointer, I'm going to square up these edges using a hand plane. Actually turned out pretty good, and now I can glue these up. When you're using a clamp like this, make sure to put some paper or some masking tape underneath your glue joint to keep the glue off the bar of the clamp. Once the glue's dry, I'm going to run this panel through my drum sander just to flatten the back so that it hangs nice and even on the wall. Or so I thought.
Well, that didn't work quite as planned. I was not paying attention when I sent that piece through the drum sander and I sanded off my nice barnwood texture. And unfortunately, I glued it up so that the two nice faces were on the front. So I'm gonna have to go without the barnwood look. Mistakes are proof that you're trying. It's still gonna be barnwood, but it's just not gonna have that nice weathered look. I'll probably do something with a stain or something to darken it up, but let's move on with this project.
Now using a straight cutting bit and an edge guide on my router, I'm going to cut a dado which will accept a small shelf. This was pretty easy to do. I just made a few passes, moving the guide as I go and sneaking up on the fit.
Sure makes a mess. Let's see how it's gonna fit. Fits in there pretty good. I think we're okay to move on.
Before I fill them, I'm going to use a little bit of compressed air to blow the dust out of all the cracks.
I'm putting some painter's tape on the underside of these cracks. That'll help keep the epoxy that I'm going to use to fill the cracks from running all the way through and getting all over the place. Now the big decision is, what color do we use for the epoxy? I think, since this is for my daughter, her favorite color right now is blue, so we're gonna go with some blue. Of course, we all know that her favorite color is gonna change by the time I get this done. That's all right.
Now I'm just using some pigment in some 2-part epoxy.
Ooh, that's cool looking.
Now I can just go about filling all the cracks with my cool blue epoxy. Not really any scientific method here, I just drizzle it down in all the cracks. Once I have them all filled, I'll take a propane torch and lightly heat the epoxy. This helps remove all the air bubbles. Plus, I've also found that it almost thins the epoxy a little bit and helps it run down into the cracks better.
All right. I think we've got these cracks pretty well soaked up. I'm gonna keep an eye on it for the next little while, just in case any of it starts to soak in a little bit more. This epoxy has a pretty long open time, so even though I have a little bit left over, I'm not worried about it going to waste because I will be able to use it for the next little while. I'm gonna let this epoxy dry overnight, then we can level it out and continue on with this project. So now I've got this thing to where I could put it together, but before I do, while it's still flat, I want to do some decorative wire inlay in there. I've got some nice flat gold wire, but the problem is I don't have any wire inlay tools, so I need to first make some. Now I've already done a little bit of experimentation with some of the tools. I've tried things like a screwdriver, metal cold chisels, and even some spring steel pallet strapping, none of which really worked out all that great. But I've come up with another idea that I think is just crazy enough to work. I've got a whole bunch of mismatched Allen wrenches. I think I can grind those down, put a nice blade tip on the end, and those will work out really well. And I'll glue them into these little spindles that I have around from something, and I think these will make some pretty nice little tools. These will end up being the handles.
Now I need to drill a hole in the center of these. I'll use the square portion of this spindle to make sure it's nice and square to the table. And then I'll just drill out the center in the appropriate size for the Allen wrench that's going to get inserted. Now over on the bell grinder, first I'll grind off the angled L portion of the Allen wrench. And then I'll very carefully grind a small bevel at the very end. I'm being very careful here not to build up too much heat. I don't want to lose the temper in this steel. If I do, then it won't hold an edge very well. Now just using some 5-minute epoxy, I'll glue my little tiny blades into the handles.
There we go. 3 different sizes of wire inlay tools.
And I'll finalize that edge with a few passes on a leather strop. These things get pretty sharp. Now I'll just work out the location of where I'm going to put my paper template.
Spray glue! All right, we are ready.
And now I'll just work my way slowly around the template using the chisels to cut a fine line, which hopefully the wire inlay will fit into. I did a lot of learning on this first one. I took my time and just went real slow and careful, trying to make this as neat as possible. I figured out that how well the chisel cuts is really dependent on the grain structure of the wood. Some portions of the board, I had to use a hammer to get the chisel to cut, and other portions, I could use my palm as the hammer, and it cut just fine.
Now this is definitely a process that does take some getting used to, as well as quite a bit of patience. You want to be very careful that you're not getting too crazy and you're trying to stay right on your lines, but you just take your time. Hopefully I'm going deep enough. We will find out soon. So there's the second one. We are now ready to install the wire. I can already tell between doing the first one and the second one that I got considerably quicker with making these indents in this one than I did with the first one. Let's move on and get this wire in. I'm gonna use a flat brass wire to do this inlay. The wire that I have is 14 thousandths thick. It's already flattened. Now there are methods where you can flatten your own wire, but the already flat stuff is not very expensive. So in my opinion, at least starting out, go ahead and get you some already flattened wire. It'll save you the steps and the headaches. So let's get this done.
Now begins probably what I would say is the most tedious process in this whole project, and that is tapping this tiny wire into the groove all the way around. I'm kind of working in sections. I'll tap a little section down in, and then I'll secure it with some glue, and then move on, trimming it off where I need to trim it.
Is that the tiniest little mallet you've seen? It's just a little piece of dowel with a piece of a broken shovel handle glued together. It works really good.
Once I'm all done, then I'll go back around the outside and glue it all in. I feel like this medium CA glue is still too thin. I had a lot of it still wick into the pores of the wood and ended up causing me some troubles. I feel like I probably should have used a thick, but that's how I learn. Just gotta try things out, see what works, see what doesn't.
Well, there's one down. I'm not gonna bore you with me doing the second one. That took quite a bit of time. Probably took me about 20 to 25 minutes to get that whole thing in there. Now, a lot of that may be due to my inexperience and learning along the way. The only thing I'm not completely happy with was the fact that I didn't have any thicker super glue. I don't like the way this wicks, and I thought the medium stuff was gonna be okay. Hopefully that doesn't cause us any issues later on when we get into finishing and keeping any stain from penetrating, but we'll see how that turns out. I'm gonna do this next one off camera. I'm gonna repeat the same process, slowly working it around, gluing it in place as I go, and I will be back when we have that done. Well, it didn't come out too bad. I do think that the CA glue was probably not the best idea, at least not that thin stuff. It did kind of wick out into the fibers of the board and made it kind of hard to sand down. Also, I think maybe my tool was still a little bit wide. I've got some areas where it looks like the gaps along either side were filled in with some CA glue. So that tells me that I probably got the slot a little too wide for the wire, but I think overall a lot of that's going to be hidden coming up.
And now I can move ahead and glue in the shelf. This will be held in the dado just using some wood glue. No screws or nails or anything. Once the glue's dry, I'll break the edges with a block plane, and then I'll sand everything nice and round and smooth to make sure there's no sharp corners. And for the finish, I'm just going to use a couple of coats of walnut Danish oil. I want to use a darker stain because I want there to be a contrast between the brass inlay and the dark color on the wood. Now originally my plan was not to stain this, I was just going to go with the raw barnwood, but since I screwed up and sanded that off, I think this will be a nice touch. Now I need to lay out for a whole bunch of cup hooks. I'm going to apply some masking tape to the areas where I need to mark them out. And then I'll use calipers to make my measurements. This will help me keep everything nice and even.
Oh man, that came out really good. I like to work evenly from both sides to the center. That way if one of them is off a little, I can kind of adjust the distance to make it look even rather than getting all the way to one end and having a big gap to make up.
Now I can center punch and drill out all these holes. There's a total of 35 hooks in all. That should help keep things organized, at least for a couple days.
Now I just need to screw in a whole pile of these cup hooks. Let's get this done. Boom. And that wraps up this holder. It looks pretty wild with all those cup hooks. That is a total of 35 cup hooks. This thing is going to hold a lot of hair ties, necklaces, all that sort of stuff. It looks pretty wild with all of these cup hooks. There are a couple things I'm not super happy about. Of course, number one is the fact that I screwed up at the beginning and sanded off the barnwood finish. This thing would have looked a lot different if I were to have kept the barnwood. I wouldn't have done the inlays. I probably wouldn't have done any of the epoxy crack filling. It would just be some raw barnwood. Although since I did make that mistake, I did get to practice some wire inlay. For this really being my first try at wire inlay, I'm pretty happy with the way this turned out. Now I did do a couple of practice pieces going into this just to kind of get the feel of things, but really making the tools and all of that just to do this project, I think I'm happy with the way this turned out. There's definitely room for improvement here. I can make this look a lot better with a little more practice. Also, not using that CA glue would have made a very big difference, I think, too, but I'm not sure of another way to hold it in. Maybe some kind of epoxy or something like that would work well, or some wood filler. Who knows? I'm gonna have to do some experiments and figure out some better methods and improve my techniques on that. If you have any good suggestions for wire inlay, leave them down in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, ring the notification bell so you get notified every time I post new videos like this. I need to now go get this thing hung up. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it so much. We'll see you next time. That kind of stinks when you get glue in your clamp. This torch man's always sneezing. I'm unimpressed with this torch. Not sure why. Why am I talking to myself? spray. That wasn't a good idea. Great. If you ever want a reason not to buy a horse, that horse is one of them. Good thing he's not ours. We don't own any horses. Ah, all that fighting with it, my epoxy. Guess I'll mix up some more. Don't sniff the spray glue, but shake well before using. And now we'll just let that dry for a few minutes before moving on to the next step. What is the next step?